Hello everyone, I am the Meta Kirby, and welcome to my channel, The Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews under the deck text. On this episode of The Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on a commander from the streets of New Capenna, Commander Precons, Syrix, Carrier of the Flame. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. The best way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. For just $1, patrons get early access to certain videos on YouTube. In fact, patrons got a chance to see this video earlier. You can also support my channel for free by simply liking, subscribing, and sharing, which also helps out a lot. I put out a video every Monday, so you don't want to miss out. You can join my Discord server for free if you want to join the Commander Tavern community. All pertinent links are down in the description. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Syrix is a 3/3 Phoenix with flying and haste for 2 generic, 1 black, and 1 red. It has 2 synergistic triggered abilities. The first one triggers at the beginning of each end step. If your creature card left your graveyard that turn, target Phoenix you control deals damage equal to its power to any target. While this makes Syrix the first Phoenix tribal commander, I did not build Syrix as a Phoenix tribal commander. I built it as a graveyard Shenanigans commander. That's because even if Syrix was the only Phoenix in play, you can still target it to its own ability to get the damage in. As for its second triggered ability, it happens whenever another Phoenix you control dies. When that happens, you can cast Syrix from your graveyard. This further cements Syrix as a Phoenix tribal commander. However, while I did not build it as such, I can still take advantage of this ability because I'm still running a couple of Phoenixes in the deck, just not enough to warrant this being a tribal deck. However, there is synergy abound, which is the kind of graveyard shenanigans I like. Let's begin with those graveyard shenanigans that trigger Syrix, which is the whole point of having it in the command zone. It triggers whenever a creature leaves your graveyard, regardless of where to. It can be to the battlefield, your hand, exile, etc. In order to maximize these triggers, the deck is running a lot of creatures with built-in Leaves of Graveyard effects. The deck is running Bloodghast, Bloodsoaked Champion, Nether Trader, Persistent Specimen, Reassembling Skeleton, Tenacious Underdog, Flamewake Phoenix, Lightning Phoenix, Sunstreak Phoenix, and Rekindling Phoenix. See, I did include Phoenixes for the deck, it's just that they're not all Phoenixes. As I just mentioned, the point of these creatures is that they self-reanimate, whether for free, on a trigger, or paying mana. The best ones are the ones you can pay mana at instant speed for, like Persistent Skeleton and Reassembling Skeleton, since these can be used to power multiple engines in the deck. For example, sacrificing creatures for value, or to simply be able to reanimate each turn, since Syrix can trigger at each end step. Speaking of, others like Bloodghast and Nether Trader could also potentially do the same if you're able to trigger their abilities outside of your turn. For Bloodghast, you can trigger its landfall ability outside of your turn, which can be done by cracking fetch lands during an opponent's turn. With Nether Trader, if you sacrifice a creature outside of your turn, or just had one die by chump blocking, you can pay 1 black and get it back. Sunstreak Phoenix could also potentially self-reanimate outside of your turn, since it does so when day turns into night and vice versa. Fortunately, it makes it day if that Innistrad mechanic hasn't been triggered yet. While this isn't as easy to control as some of the other triggers, at least when it does happen, it could be on someone else's upkeep step, giving you that Syrix trigger at the end of that person's turn. Some of these creatures have other perks like Tenacious Underdog. Even though you can only reanimate it during your turn because you have to cast it for its blitz cost, you at least get to draw a card when it gets sacrificed afterwards. Bloodsoaked Champion and Flamewake Phoenix can also happen during our own turn because they depend on us attacking, which we can only do during our own turn. But that's fine since they're still creatures that are able to reanimate themselves. Lightning Phoenix can only be reanimated our turn and only if an opponent was dealt 3 or more damage that turn. While not free to do, it only costs 1 red, which is fine. The downside is that this will not trigger Syrix because the window for the trigger would have passed already. Lastly, Rekindling Phoenix can also only happen during our turn. There are some hoops to jump through though. The elemental token it creates has to tick around until your upkeep step, which is when we'd have to sacrifice it to its own trigger in order to reanimate the Phoenix. While this can easily be disrupted, it's not that big a deal and it's still a relatively easy Phoenix to self-reanimate, especially since it requires no mana investment to do so. Other creatures that can trigger Syrix are those that can return to your hand from the graveyard all on their own. The deck's running Clattering Augur, Gutter Bones, Sanitarium Skeleton, Squee Goblin Nabob, Relentless Dead, and Magma Phoenix. See? Another Phoenix. With the exception of Gutter Bones and Squee Goblin Nabob, the rest of these creatures can be activated at instant speed outside of our turn to get further mileage from Syrix's trigger. That doesn't mean these are bad, because Squee, for example, returns for free during the beginning of our upkeep, so it will always trigger Syrix during our own end step. Gutter Bones requires an opponent losing life during our turn, but that's bound to happen, so it's not so bad. The rest of them aren't that expensive to return to our hand. While this might seem a bit slow, this deck aims to win via slow burn produced by the deck's synergies. We can still win with 1,000 cuts, which we'll soon see, so we're in it for a long time, not a fun time. Magma Phoenix is especially good since we can use it as a mass burn effect on a body when it dies. Since we'll mostly be able to control when our creatures die, this is amazing against weenie tokens and potentially hate bears, even if we do end up killing our own creatures, which in the grander scheme of things won't matter as we've just seen and will continue to see. As for assisted reanimation, the deck is running plenty of effects to that end. Whisper Blood Liturgist, Demon of Dark Schemes, and Liliana Heretical Healer are just some of them. Whisper requires sacrificing 2 creatures and tapping, but he can reanimate any creature from our graveyard at instant speed, something that Syrix will enjoy outside of our turn. The creature also returns untapped, so it can be used for a surprise block or a chump block in a pinch. Since we have so many creatures that can self-reanimate or self-recover, we have plenty of sacrifice fodder for Whisper and the other sacrifice outlets in the deck. The demon is amazing here since it could also serve as a way to wipe the board of weenie tokens and hate bears. It does hit our own creatures, but that's not an issue. We then get an energy counter when another creature dies, which we can use to pay its activated ability to reanimate any creature from any graveyard. Reanimating from someone else's graveyard won't trigger Syrix though, so keep that in mind. It's also a 5/5 with flying for 6 mana, so that's nothing to scoff at. What's great about Demon of Dark Schemes and the previously mentioned Magma Phoenix is being able to sacrifice them and reanimate them at will to really keep those weenie tokens decked down. Soon we'll see why these types of decks can be a nuisance to us. Liliana doesn't reanimate per se, she'd have to transform into Liliana Defiant Necromancer, which should be a breeze to trigger since we're constantly killing off our own creatures. With her second loyalty ability, we can reanimate any of our non-legendary creatures. It does take a bit of turns to get enough loyalty though. Her +2 ability is amazing since we can disrupt opponents but not us, since we can simply discard any creature we can get back from the graveyard anyways. However, it's her emblem that we want to aim for. It'll take a couple of turns, but it's worth it. Whenever a creature dies, we return it to the battlefield under our control at the beginning of the next end step. Unfortunately, that won't trigger Syrix since the trigger is happening at the same time, so the window is closed by then, but we're still eternally reanimating any creatures that die, which is busted. It's a shame the Cinematic Phoenix is only available to a select few WotC employees. This Phoenix is too on flavor for this deck. That being said, it's super broken, so I'm kind of glad only a handful of people on the planet can legally play with this. Coming back down from that cloud, we have Dawn of the Dead and Strands of Night. While Dawn of the Dead only triggers during our upkeep, it does reanimate one of our creatures for free. We simply lose 1 life, which is nothing. That being said, the creature gets exiled at the end of our turn, so make sure to sacrifice it or kill it off somehow before that happens so you don't lose it. Strands of Night is better since it can be activated at instant speed and the creature doesn't return tapped. That being said, we have to pay 2 black mana, 2 life, and sacrifice a swamp. This isn't a problem because the deck is running Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth, turning all lands into swamps, and Crucible of Worlds in order to replay those sacrificed lands. Either way, Urborg is great on its own since this deck is practically mono black except for a literal handful of cards. The Crucible is also amazing since it also lets us recycle our fetch lands. Keep in mind that it helps us get Bloodghast at instant speed. Plus the deck isn't green, so guaranteeing a land drop each turn is great, especially lands like Witch's Cottage. This doesn't take up a slot in the deck and can be fetched for at instant speed. This effect triggers Syrix even though the creature is going to the top of the library because it's still leaving the graveyard to do so. Oh, and not only can this be fetched for at instant speed since it's a swamp, we can sacrifice it to Strands of Night and then replay it with Crucible of Worlds to reuse this effect as many times as we want, just oozing synergy. Similarly, Malevolent Awakening and Tortured Existence are 2 more cards that don't outright reanimate, but they do help us recover creatures to our hand. The best part is that it can be done at instant speed. We can do some interesting loops with these cards since you can discard or sacrifice a creature that can recover or reanimate itself in order to recover a creature that doesn't. That way you're getting net value from them while also triggering Syrix. Speaking of, Syrix is only 3 power. I mentioned earlier that the deck can still win via slow burn. However, if we want to increase the heat, we can boost Syrix's power with things like Loxodon Warhammer, Blackblade Reforged, and Demon Spine Whip. Keep in mind that we don't need other Phoenixes for Syrix's damaging ability, it can target itself. So if going through all this work for just 3 damage to the face doesn't seem like much, then increase that damage. These can also help you win via incidental commander damage as well. Syrix flies and has haste, so it could potentially fly over any blockers and smack an opponent. This makes Blackblade Reforged and Demon Spine Whip especially dangerous. If we're never missing land drops, Blackblade makes Syrix huge. Demon Spine Whip being a mana sink means that all of those lands can also fuel its activated ability. However, the deck also has plenty of ways of generating a ton of mana, but we'll see that near the end of the video. Lightning Greaves is added for good measure since the commander damage kill is viable enough. While we do have the potential of reanimating Syrix either by its own trigger or straight up reanimation, thus negating its commander attacks most of the time, this can also be used to protect any other combo piece. We don't need a lot of creature protection in this deck, but equipping for 0 and giving haste is worth including as well. Witch's Clinic is another way to make the most of Syrix. With enough power, we can activate this land that does not take up a slot in the deck to gain a ton of life, making it even harder to take us out of the game. However, it can also be used when Syrix does non-combat damage, which happens frequently. Lastly, Massive Nexus is included. The deck is only running 5 Phoenixes apart from Syrix, but that doesn't mean that we can't try and make the absolute most of things. If all of our creatures are Phoenixes, then we can always choose the creature we control with the biggest power to Syrix's trigger. Also, that means that any creature we control that dies will trigger Syrix's self-reanimating trigger, really hammering in the fact that we'll almost never recast Syrix with a higher command tax. If that weren't enough, we can also activate it to create a 2/2 changeling, which can not only serve as sacrifice fodder, but is also a phoenix whenever it matters. Speaking of sacrifice fodder, I've been mentioning that quite a few times during the video, as well as the synergy in the deck and the way it aims to slow burn opponents to oblivion. That's because those self-reanimating and self-recovering creatures, as well as the effects that can do it to any creature, aren't included solely to make the most out of Syrix's ability. That's only half the engine. The other half is taking advantage of always having creatures to pay for costs that require bodies. Sadistic Hypnotist and Mind Slash do so in spades. These cards are brutal and for good reason. With enough mana, you could potentially keep opponents from keeping any cards by sacrificing creatures like Reassembling Skeleton and Persistent Specimen. While these effects need to be activated at sorcery speed, it's well worth the effort. Attrition and Shivan Harvest are some more backbreaking effects that require tribute. While Attrition can only hit non-black creatures, that won't really be a problem, as we'll soon see. Plus, we can activate it at instant speed, which is amazing. Same with Shivan Harvest. While plenty of Commander players out there believe that lands are sacred, worry not, because this only hits non-basic lands. So any utility lands, lands that can tap down for a ton of mana, etc. should be fair game. Viscera Seer is a free sacrifice outlet, ubiquitous in plenty of aristocrat decks. While we don't draw per se, which is fine, we can still sacrifice a creature for free at instant speed with the bonus of fixing the top card of our library. That being said, the deck does have ways of drawing cards based off of our creatures dying. Grim Haruspix, Harvester of Souls, Midnight Reaper, Dark Prophecy, and Liliana Dreadhorde General do just that. Harvester of Souls does it better since it also triggers off of opponents' creatures dying. Unfortunately, with the exception of Dark Prophecy and Liliana, these effects only trigger off of non-token creatures dying, which is fine since we're killing off all of those creature cards that can self-reanimate and self-recover anyways, so it's fine. Liliana also has more relevant abilities besides her triggered one. She can create sacrifice fodder and chump blockers with her +1 ability. Her -4 ability is super busted in this deck since it has all players sacrifice 2 creatures, which hardly affects us at all. In fact, doing so is practically all upside. We'll also be doing more of this with the deck, but we'll see that in a bit. Her ultimate isn't really the goal of running her, but it can potentially put opponents in a position to scoop or soon lose the game. Erebos Bleakhearted can also draw us cards whenever one of our creatures die, but we have to pay 2 life to draw the card. While there are plenty of effects that are costing us life in this deck, recall that all of the lifelink effects mentioned earlier. Erebos also has a built-in sacrifice outlet that can be used to snipe any creature given enough mana. Isolde the Blood Witch can also draw us cards, but we'd have to be sacrificing black creatures, of which the deck has no shortage of. If the sacrificed creature was red, then we could shock any target, but most of the time, we'd be sacrificing skeletons to draw a card for just 2 generic mana. Skull Clamp is another way to draw cards off of our creatures dying. The creature does have to have it equipped first. That being said, most of the creatures that self-reanimate or self-recover have a toughness of 1, so for just 1 mana we can draw 2 cards. With enough mana, we can return those creatures to the battlefield and then draw even more cards. This card is insane here. CDC Unstead Vizier takes it a step further by being a tutor on a body. Since you can exploit Zombie CDC to herself, you can then consistently reanimate her and exploit her to tutor indefinitely many times, assembling as many engines as you want. The deck doesn't have any infinite combos, and almost all the engine pieces exist across multiple cards with similar functions, but it's still good to include for some consistency, even if it's the only tutor in the deck. She also has Death Touch, which makes her a great attack deterrent if you choose to keep her around, or as a Rattlesnake if you reanimate her at instant speed in response to blocks. Reliquary Tower is included due to how many cards you can actually draw into once these engines are assembled. While we don't care about discarding away creatures that can self-reanimate or self-recover, keeping a fat hand without taking up a slot in the deck is good too. Haven Gold Laboratory is another land that doesn't take up a slot in the deck, and that's honestly the main reason it's in here. The deck is just 2 colored, so it's okay. The reason for that is because, unlike with the way I speak, this card is incredibly slow. While it's incredibly overcosted to create a clue token for 4 mana and tapping, essentially depriving you of 5 mana to do so, we can still get at least some incidental card draw from cracking clues. However, if we'd cracked 3 or more clues that turn, it transforms into Haven Gold Mastery, reanimating a creature when it does so. Again, super slow, but it doesn't really take up a slot. It can also tap from black mana at the cost of 1 life. While it is slow to use, the deck doesn't aim to win as quickly as possible either, so I did find it somewhat useful in testing. It can also transform back when the creature it reanimated died, in case you want to go through all this work all over again. Please don't. Ashnod's Altar and Phyrexian Tower are some amazing ways to generate mana. While the tower can unfortunately only be used once due to tapping, at least it doesn't take up a slot in the deck. Obviously, Ashnod's Altar is the better of the two since it's free and at instant speed. This altar does some serious work in this deck. You could also include Phyrexian Altar if you wanted to, but I found that Ashnod's Altar was enough. Plus, Phyrexian Altar is currently sitting at almost $90, so I hope it gets reprinted in either Dominaria set, since we're obviously going to be dealing with Phyrexians. Pitiless Plunderer and Pawn of Ulamog are some more synergistic ways of generating mana. Pitiless Plunderer has the upper hand of the two since it doesn't care about the creature being a token or not. That being said, Pawn of Ulamog creating creature tokens that can self-sacrifice for mana does also help fuel some of the deck's other engines, so it can power multiple things at once, which is amazing. Burnished Heart is a great way to ramp for lands in a non-green deck. While it does cost 3 to cast and 3 to activate, since it self-sacrifices, with enough mana we can reanimate it later on to continue wrapping for basics. With this and Crucible of Worlds, along with the deck's fetch lands, there are a total of 10 basic lands in the deck, meaning that we can definitely make the most of Burnished Heart and reusing fetch lands. Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Rakdos Signet, and Talisman of Indulgence is the deck's only other ways of accelerating its mana output due to not being green, but mana acceleration isn't really that big of an issue for black decks. That being said, consistently cracking and reanimating Burnished Heart will get us ahead in no time. Going back to value, Tormod the Desecrator and Desecrated Tomb are some more ways to make the most out of those creatures mentioned in the beginning of the video. Each time one of those creatures leaves the graveyard, we get a tapped 2/2 zombie or 1/1 flying bat respectively. This engine is insane. We get sacrifice fodder, or we can potentially assemble a horde over time. We can even go infinite if you wanted to by including Thornbite Staff. Along with either Tormod or Desecrated Tomb, combined with Whisper, we can get infinite death triggers, reanimation triggers, etc. Here's how it works. Let's say we have Tormod with Whisper equipped with Thornbite Staff. We sacrifice any 2 creatures to start. Let's say Reassembling Skeleton and Persistent Specimen. We reanimate any creature. Let's say Gutterbones. Since a creature left the graveyard, Tormod creates a zombie token. Since a creature died, Thornbite Staff triggers, untapping Whisper. And now we're back to where we started, with 2 creatures to help start the loop all over again. While I mentioned that I did not have any infinite combos in the deck, you could definitely run Thornbite Staff if you want this to happen, since it would be the only missing piece. As for why you'd want to go infinite with this engine, that's because the deck's running Zulaport Cutthroat, Sir Conrad the Grim, and Peripherals God of the Forge. Including either of this in the previous engine and it's game over for the table. Granted, since the deck is all about that slow burn, these cards still do a ton of damage across the board as we're sacrificing, reanimating, recasting, etc. all of those previously mentioned creatures. While Peripherals might be more expensive than something like Impact Tremors or even Woody Roastmaster, the benefit of Peripherals is that he's indestructible, plus he also serves as a mana sink to pump our other creatures. Keep in mind that the direct damage dealt by Syrix is dependent on the power of target Phoenix we control. Other ways we can make the most of those self-recurring creatures is with Stax Effects, when stacks used to mean smokestack type effects and not taxing effects. Call to the Grave, Ruthless Winnower, Shieldred Whispering One, and Kuan Ogre Ascended are some of those effects in the deck. Well, Kuan when it flips into its essence. Each of these trigger at the beginning of each player's upkeep, forcing them to sacrifice a creature. Well, except for Shieldred, she reanimates one of our creatures for us during our upkeep, so she actually performs double duty in our deck. So busted. In any case, we don't care to sacrifice a creature during our upkeep because that can be a token or any creature we could just get back later. But for opponents, this can be quite harrowing, which is why I made note to mention token decks a while back. If our opponents are also creating creature tokens to not be affected by these, then consistently re-triggering Magma Phoenix and Demon of Dark Schemes will put them in their place. Rankle Master of Pranks and Eradicator Valkyrie are 2 more similar effects, but these only trigger during our combat. We have to deal combat damage with Rankle, so it's not always guaranteed, but he does have flying and haste, which does help him out. Valkyrie doesn't need to connect though, it just needs to attack. And even then we can boost whatever that turn as long as it's attacking. Saving the best for last, you know I can't talk about Sacrifice Effects without mentioning Dictate of Erebos and Grave Pact, my two favorite mono black enchantments. We are constantly sacrificing our creatures in this deck. Every time we do, the entire table has to sacrifice a creature. With enough mana, cards like Persistent Specimen or Relentless Dead can potentially wipe out the opponent's entire board. Cabal Coffers and Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, two very important lands in the deck, also help us have enough mana, something I've been mentioning quite often in this video. The deck is mostly black, so Nykthos will be tapping down for a ton of mana. The deck also has plenty of swamps, so even without Urborg to move Yawgmoth, the Coffers can still tap down for plenty of mana. These lands do some serious work. Speaking of, the rest of the deck is just the rest of the lands. The deck's running all 7 fetch lands: Blood Crypt, Canyon Slough, Smoldering Marsh, Sulphurous Mire, Tainted Peak, Dragon Skull Summit, Luxury Suite, Graven Cairns, Command Tower, and Ancient Tomb, as well as 5 of each basic land. As mentioned earlier with how we can reuse our fetch lands as well as Burnished Heart, having 10 basic lands is a huge benefit. It also doesn't color screw us, being as it's a 2-color deck. As with all of my deck techs, you can build your mana base according to your budget. Whether you include more expensive cards or even cheaper cards is up to you. You do you. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Syrix, Carrier of the Flame. While I'm aware that almost everyone who saw this commander was super excited at the prospect of building a Phoenix tribal deck with it, that was not the first thing I thought of. The first thing that came to my mind was Graveyard Shenanigans, thanks to Syrix also having access to black. I do like that it can also open other venues of winning, such as direct damage and slow burn, so I decided to combine those Graveyard Hijinxes with controlling the boards and taking life away. If you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons of the Brewers for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link, that also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of the Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am Kirby, and happy brewing.